Welcome back to class, my dear students. Today we are going to talk about SQL components, and we have three major ones that we are going to talk about for this class, but we definitely have more that you can research on outside this class. The three SQL components I'll talk about in this class are DDL, DML, and DCL. DDL basically stands for Data Definition Language. DML stands for Data Manipulation Language, and DCL stands for Data Control Language. You know, the funny thing is, this SQL component that I'm about to explain to you is just big grammar. But this big grammar cost me a job that I really wanted to have at a point in my career. Do you know why? Because in the job interview, they asked me if I knew DDL, DML, and DCL. And I'm like, I've never heard this before. But can you believe that what they are asking for is what I can actually do? But because of the packaging and the name they gave it, I didn't know that I knew it. And I don't want you to go through that. And that is why I'm explaining it to you in this video. So let's start with DDL. I said DDL is Data Definition Language. DDL commands are used to define and manage database structures. Okay, so what I mean by database structure is tables. So examples of queries that we have under data definition language are create, alter, drop, truncate. These are the queries that we have under DDL. So you already know that we use the create query to create a new table or a new database. And you can see we use the create query here. So if they ask you that, give us examples of DDL query, like data definition language, you can mention create. Another example of DDL is alter. Alter statement is basically used to modify existing table. Okay, so let's say we want to add or modify columns in a particular table, then we use alter query. You have to know that alter is basically used to edit and modify column. Column, put that column in capital letter in your notes because we have another query entirely that we use to modify rows. So let's use this table that we created from our last class as an example. Let's say I want to change this first name column data type. What we used initially was varchar 50. Let's say now I want to use varchar 450 instead of varchar 50 as the data type. I can use the alter query to change the data type for that column now. So now I'm just going to say alter table. You first want to specify the table you want to alter. In this case, that will be the employees table. So I'll do employees. Okay, and then you now say alter column. Okay, so once I say alter column now, I'm going to specify the column I want to alter. This case, I want to alter the first name column. So if you don't know the data type that it was initially, you can also check manually by coming here to my first DB under tables. You see the tables. This is the employees table I'm trying to work on. If you expand this column, you are going to see the different columns you have in that table together with the data type that you have. You can see this employee ID. We specified that it should be the primary key. Data type is integer. Then we have the first name, which is varchar 50. The first name in this case is what I'm trying to convert to varchar 450. So once I specify the first name that I want to alter the column first name, so I'll just put the new data type that I want to assign to it here. If you want to change it to integer or you want to change it to date column, whatever you want to change, it doesn't have to be varchar though. Okay, I'm just using this as an example. Let's have to change it to varchar 450. I'm just going to write my varchar 450 here, and then I'm going to run it. Command completed successfully, right? But you can see that it has not changed here yet. So I'll just come here. Let's refresh it. And let's re-expand employee table column. Can you see now that it went from varchar 50 to varchar 450? This is just one of the ways that we can use the alter query in SQL, which is under the data definition language. Okay, so now let's move to the next data definition language, which is drop. Drop statements, we use it to delete an existing database object. When I say database object, I mean database or table. So let's say we want to delete this employees table. I can use the drop query. I can easily just say drop table, and then I'm just going to specify the name of the table, employees. Let's run this. I press F5 to run. Okay, I've deleted the table now. Let me refresh my database. okay, and check the tables that I have. You can see now that we no longer have employees table. That is what drop does. It is used to delete existing database objects. It could be a database and it could be a table. Okay. So if you also want to drop like a database, you can just say drop my first DB. It's going to delete this database. So you want to be careful whenever you are using drop. Remember that working with SQL means you'll be working in your company's database. And if you delete or you update or you do any modification, you cannot undo it. You cannot undo whatever you do. Okay, so you have to be very careful when you are doing modification in the database. Truncate is used to delete all rows from a table. I said drop is used to delete. And now I'm sure you're already wondering that I'm saying truncate is used to delete again. So what's now the difference? When you use drop, drop is going to delete everything. Like the table will no longer exist again or the database will no longer exist again. But when you use truncate, truncate will delete all rows from the table, but the table structure will remain, which is the department's ID and the department's name. If I truncate this table, I'm going to lose all the values inside the table, but the column header will still remain. So now we want to truncate the department table. So we can just do truncate table, and then we are going to specify the table name. Okay, so let's run it. Okay, so now let's try to check the departments table and see if it still exists. You can see now that we still have the departments table. If we call for departments table, it's still showing, but we no longer have all the values inside it, but we still have the column header. That brings us to the end of DDL. So now let's move to DML. So DML stands for Data Manipulation Language. And DML commands are used basically for managing data within the database objects. What are examples of query that we use to manage data? Select is used to manage data. We also use insert to manage data. We use update and we use delete as well. Okay, now it looks more confusing because why do we have delete when we talked about drop and truncate? I'm going to explain to you the difference between the three. I've explained the difference between these two, and I'll also explain what this does shortly. You already know what select is. Select statement is used to query data from a database, like draft out the columns that we want to see. And then insert, you also know what insert is. Insert is used to add new rows to a table. Like after creating table, you use the insert to add new rows to the table. We use updates to modify existing rows in a table. You remember when I talked about alter, I said we use alter to add and modify columns. That's why I said you should write your columns in capital letter. When talking about updates now, it's also used to modify, but it is used to modify rows. So update works to modify rows, while alter works to modify columns. And let's say an example of how we can use updates in this data. Let me try to create this employees table again. Remember that we deleted it earlier. So I can use it for this example. We have it down here. So let's just say I want to update the name of this John in this first row. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to say updates. Then I'm going to specify my table name. The table name we are working with now is the employees table, right? And then I'll go to the next line and I'll specify what I want to set. That's me specifying the column I want to modify. So I want to say set the first name. The first name is what I want to change. I want to change it to, let me just change it to my name. Okay, so I want to change it to Tosin, right? And then I can now specify a condition. I want to update my employees table and I want to set first name to Tosin. If I run this one, I'm going to change all the first name to Tosin. But let me specify that I only want to change for employee ID 1. That means I want to change John to Tosin. So I can say where employee ID equals to 1. Okay, so if you are getting this red line and your code is correct, you can just click on the IntelliSense enabled writing. Let's run it. One row affected, right? Let's check our table now. Can you see now that we've successfully modified it from John to Tosin? Okay, now that you understand what the update does, let's now talk about the delete. Basically use the delete statement to remove rows from our table. Okay, so let's say I want to remove a particular row. Remember, the drop will delete the whole table. Truncate will remove the values but leave the table structure. That's like the column header. But delete is used to remove rows. So let's say I want to remove this row or this row from the table. Then I can use delete to do that. Okay, so let's have an example of how we can use delete query. So I can say delete. It's from, then I'm going to specify the table. In this case, I want to delete from the employees table. And then I can just specify a condition that where the employee ID, right? I can say where the employee ID, okay, equals to, let's do 2. So it will delete this Jane Smith, okay? So let's run it. Okay, one row affected. Now let's check what our table looks like now. You can see now that we no longer have that row 2, and that is what the delete query does. So lastly, let's move to DCL. Let me explain what DCL does and the queries under DCL. DCL stands for Data Control Language. So DCL command are basically used to control access to data in the database, right? We have two queries that we use under the DCL. We have the grant and then we have the revoke. Let me explain each one of it. The grant statement is used to give a user privilege on the database. So let's say in our company, we just hired a junior data analyst and we want to give the junior data analyst access to the database, then we can use grants to give the user access to the database. But let's say we just let go one of the data analysts we have in our company and we want to remove their access from the database, then we use revoke to remove their access from the database. Okay. And you have to also know that we can use this grant query together with select, insert, update. What I mean by that is whenever you are granting somebody access to the database, you can either grant them access to only check the table, like to view only, or you can also grant them access to modify, like delete something, like update something. So you can specify the type of access you want to give them, or you can give them all access. Whatever access you give the person, you can take it back. So the first step to use the grant and revoke is we first have to create a user in our database. We have to create a user in the database to use the query create login. Okay, so now you want to specify the username you want to give that login. Let me just call it test user for now. Okay, and then I want to also specify password. So it's more like I want to create a login, like sign up on a website or something. You're going to basically put in your login ID and also the password. Okay, so I can just say with password. So let's just do let me do pass 123 or something as the password. So I'm trying to create a user with this ID and this password. I also have to create the user that will use the login if it doesn't exist before. So I'm going to create user as well. I want to create user for this ID. Okay. So I want to create the user for that ID and the login details for that person will be this, right? Let me quickly recap. I first created login for a user. I specified the ID and the password for that user. But the user, if it doesn't exist already, then I'm creating the user in my database, okay? So that when somebody uses this login, this ID, and this password, they'll be able to access whatever database I give them access to and whatever permission I give to them. Okay, so the command is completed successfully. After you create the login and the user, the next step is to grant permission to the user. So in this case, let me grant them permission to only view the data. Okay, view the data in the sense that they can only use the select query on the database. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to do grant select. Okay, so you're using the grant query, but what kind of permission? I want to allow them select only. All right, so I'm going to grant select on what data table do I want to allow them access to. This healthcare, let's use healthcare in this case. So I'll say healthcare. So who do I want to grant the access to? To this user that I created in my database. Okay, so I'm going to say to test user. So what I'm doing now is I want to grant them permission. So I'm saying grant what kind of permission? Only to select which table, which data table, this table alone. To who? To this user that I created. Okay. So now if I run this now, I'm going to grant them permission to that table. If you try it on your PC, you use this ID and you use this password, then you'll be able to access the healthcare data table that I have in my own database. And I know you're already wondering that how can you, where are you going to put the login details. So you remember whenever you just opened your query and it brings you to this tab, okay, this is exactly where you can paste your username and your password. But you can see now that you can't paste it. That's because the authentication is set to these windows. I can set it to SQL Server authentication, and then I can paste the login here. The ID log, that's the test user, and the password, and it's going to automatically connect me to that database. Okay, and remember that you can grant different kind of permission. You can grant, select, insert. If you also want the person to add or delete something, you can write it like this. If you don't want it to write it like this, you can just do grant all. So it's going to grant them all permission entirely. Okay. So now that we've granted them permission, let's also remove our permission. Okay. So let's use the revoke. I'll show you how to do that. Okay, so to revoke our permission, all we have to do is we are going to type revoke. So since what we did was to grant them select, what we are going to remove back it will be select. So we are going to go revoke select on what data table, healthcare table, which we granted them access to earlier. So instead of to, when you grant something, you grant it to. When you want to collect something back, you collect it from. So it's just like simple English. So then you say from the user ID running. So now I've revoked the access. So now that I've revoked the access, if you try to log in with this detail, you cannot stay connected to my database because I've already revoked the access. And that brings us to the end of this class where we talked about SQL components. The three major ones are DDL, DML, and DCL. And I've also explained each of the queries under each of these SQL components. We've come to the end of today's class, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye for now.